はい。それでは定刻となりましたので、
Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to start the seminar. Thank you very much for joining us despite your busy schedule today. I am Emma, the Program Manager of the Japan Energy Transition Initiative, one of the co-organizers of this webinar. Thank you very much for today. First, housekeeping announcements on Zoom. For those who would like to use simultaneous interpretation, please make sure to log in from the Zoom app and click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen and select the option for English or Japanese.
Please make sure to log in from the Zoom app and click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen and select the option for English. 本日のウェビナー、
This webinar is titled Policy Innovation in the Power Sector Towards Net Zero Emission. And from the perspective of what the power sector can play as a role in order to implement 2050 net zero goal with ambitious energy policy, and there'll be experts from around the world making presentations, and we accept questions from Q&A box throughout the course of the seminar. And this webinar will be recorded, and the webinar video and the presentation materials will be emailed to you on a later date for those of you who are participating. And let me just introduce Japan Energy Transition Initiative, one of the co-organizer of this webinar. JETI was established in 2019 with the partnership of think tanks in and outside of Japan, Influence Map, and IGES, Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, participating. They are disseminating latest information on energy transition and climate change, like this webinar that we're having. Now I'd like to invite Ms. Jen Ho from AIGCC, the co-organizer of this seminar, to give us opening remarks.
Thank you, Emma. AIGCC is very pleased to be co-hosting today's webinar with JETI. A quick introduction to the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change. AIGCC is an initiative to create awareness and encourage action among Asia's asset owners and financial institutions about the risks and opportunities associated with climate change and low carbon investing. We are a member organization with members from 13 different markets in Asia and internationally, and include asset owners and managers with a combined asset under management of over 26 trillion US dollar. We provide capacity and a trusted forum for investors active in Asia to share best practice and to collaborate on investment activity, risk management, engagement, and policy related to climate change. One of the projects under our investor practice workstream is the recently launched Asian Utilities Engagement Program, which was supported at launch by 13 institutional investors responsible for $8.8 trillion in asset under management. Through the program, investors are seeking to collaboratively engage with Asia's systematically important electric utilities to increase the effectiveness of climate engagement with these companies with a common agenda. In Japan, the investor participants are engaging with two focused utility companies. So today's discussion on policy innovation and collaboration between the power sector and the government is very timely indeed. With that, I'll pass on to Kai Takahashi, our moderator for today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your participation, ladies and gentlemen. I will be serving as the moderator of the session. My name is Takahashi. Let me give a brief self-introduction. And I work at a think tank, and I am part of the business task force at IGES. And normally, I am looking at the business trends that are happening in the area and providing the latest movements, and also providing some aid in developing policies as well. So we'd like to jump into the actual topics today. And today we will be looking at the policy innovation in the power sector towards net zero emissions. And looking at how the power policy should change in order to achieve these goals. And we have a prestigious panel today, and I look forward to those presentations. But before the innovation, what is the current status? What are we facing right now? I want to just give you a very brief description about that first. So let me share my screen.
はい。まずグローバルなですね、ベンチマーク
So first, if we look at the global benchmark,
紹介いたします。こちら有名ですので、
this is quite well known. So I think maybe perhaps many of you are already familiar with this, and I apologize if that is the case. This is the Iea Net Zero Scenario, and how the utility, or rather the power, should be. Looking at 2030, we see that renewables is 61%.
でカーボンニュートラルが達成される
And
べき2050年には
2050 is when carbon neutral should be achieved, and we see that renewables at that time would be about 90%.
脱炭素の中心になるんだという
Renewables will become the central
もうかなり浸透しておりまして、
crux of decarbonization, and that's well known. At G7,
の首脳会宣言ですね、コミュニケでは
in the communique,
ここは2030年代
they
にできるだけ
announced that the industrialized nations should decarbonize their power systems as much as possible. So this was quite clearly put out there. And so the world is really making haste towards renewables. So that was the average for the world. But now I'd like to look at Japan, how much renewables is necessary. So there are various people with differing views about how much, for example, nuclear has a role to play, and how much cost ramifications there will be, and how much solar is it going to be, wind is it going to be. So there's a lot of different discussions that are ongoing. So there's no single number, but I just want to give you this as one example. And by 2030, and for the GHG reductions, the 46% and achieving towards 50% is what Prime Minister Suga has declared. If it was going to be 50% as the target, then renewables have to be account for 60%. That is what this analysis is telling us. This is from Maryland University, a researcher there. So this is one such study. So this is just one position out of very many positions, but overall in terms of scale, it would be 2 times or 3 times more renewables than we have at the present day. Based on that understanding, the Japanese government is also enhancing policies for renewables. For example, last year in July, the Minister Kajiyama announced that the inefficient coal-fired thermal will be phased out by 2030, and policies to create a renewable energy economic society would be put in place. And after that, there was a carbon neutral announcement. And based on that, the Minister Okono decided that he would put together a task force to look at the renewable energy regulations and take a full review of that. And of course, within renewables, we have offshore wind. So the vision for offshore wind industry was put together, and the green growth strategy was also put in place. After that, the Prime Minister not only announced the 2050 carbon neutral, but also announced the GHG reduction goals for fiscal 2030. And right now, the discussion is centering around what the reduction will be, and also how much renewables will be put in place. Also, in some major documents like the basic policies on economic and physical management and reform, as well as the growth strategy implementation plan, it clearly indicated the first priority placed on renewables. And also the green growth strategy has been revised, and the policies will be considered for this as well. Also, statements have been made at the G7 for overwhelming decarbonization. And here is just an excerpt of where there was a clearly indication of first priority on renewables. So how much actual renewables would it be? The Agency of Natural Resources and Energy and the Strategic Policy Committee is looking into this. This is the place where this is being discussed. And according to the discussions on July 13, the 312 billion kilowatt hours was the number that was provided. The overall demand has not been provided yet. So we cannot really tell what the ratio is in terms of a percentage from just this table. However, we believe that it probably be somewhere around 30% mark. And that will not be enough to meet the reduction targets. So there was a proposal from the agency that there should be a further step in terms of looking into this issue. So I think that perhaps this is something that you're well familiar with because it was covered in the news. It is about the cost of renewables, but looking at the industrial use of photovoltaic, this is actually the cheapest, and this received a lot of attention. And if we look at the generation costs, if you have variable supply that is connected to the grid, there is other costs that would have to be accounted for, and that needs to be well considered. We need to make sure that that value is not going to be overwhelming, and making sure that the renewables are maintained in such a way. And we need to consider what the integration costs would be. And in a different committee, there's a task force under the Ministry of under Minister Kono, and there is the 3 renewable principles that have been put in place. And if I read all of this, it will take too much time, so I'll refrain from doing that. But it's one principle is to have renewable energy first in considering policy and budgeting. The second is to look at the flexibility using EVs, using hydrogen effectively in order to reduce the integration costs. So that's the second principle. The third is for the new players to be able to play a major role and making sure that there is fair competition, an environment conducive to that. When I developed these presentation slides, this is last week, this was the most current status, but actually right now, as we speak, there is the Strategic Policy Committee being convened, and there was a material provided in the agency's website regarding the strategic energy plan. And I think that what would be most relevant for you would be the ratios here. So here is the power. We see non-fossil fuel is 44%. Here, sorry, it's 59% is non-fossil fuel. And then renewables is 36 to 38%. And at the beginning, I mentioned the global numbers. We still have a little bit more to go, I think. And nuclear here, whether it's actually going to meet these levels is another question. So we need to have the front loading of renewables as much as possible and increase that number as much as possible. That'll be very important. So with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation, and we'd like to move on to the panelists' presentations, which is the main program for today. So first of all, I'd like to call upon the Secretary General from Eurelectric, Mr. Christian Ruby, to give a presentation. And in terms of his background and organization, let me give you a brief introduction. Mr. Christian Ruby became the Secretary General in January 2017. Before that, he was involved in the development of policy and strategy at Wind Europe as the Chief Policy Officer, and worked to develop wind power within and outside of Europe. And before that, he worked with the European Commission Climate Change Commissioner Connie Hedegaard, and also worked at the Danish Ministry of Climate and Energy and the Ministry of Environment. So he's worked both on the utilities or industry side as well as the government side. In terms of the Eurelectric organization, is a industry group with more than 3,500 European electric power companies. And the total business is 200 billion euros, about 23.8 trillion yen. In order to achieve carbon neutral in 2050, it has invested extensively in low carbon technologies and has announced that coal-fired power generation will not be developed after 2020. They have also expressed support for policies that utilize market mechanism for emission trading. And so industry organizations that actually agree to that is quite progressive. So I apologize for the extended introduction, but Mr. Ruby, the floor is yours.
Hello and good morning. I realize it's afternoon already in Japan. Here it's just after 9 o'clock in the morning in Europe. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today. What I promised to do was to give a little bit of an overview of the European situation, what's going on in Europe in terms of policies, what is the climate policy, and why is it that the industry association sees electrification as a winning strategy to combat climate change. So first off, I want to say, why is it that a big industry organization that basically has its prime business in producing power takes such an interest in climate change? Well, I would say two things. First of all, when producing electricity, we rely on a stable business environment, and that stable business environment is threatened today because of climate change, or you can even say climate chaos. If you have followed the news, you will have seen that big parts of Europe has suffered massive floods in recent days. Austria, Germany, Belgium, parts of France are seeing the big cities inundated, flooded, massive damages to private homes, private property, but also to electric installations. And unfortunately, you know very well that this is the picture all over the globe. In the US, firestorms and ravaging the electric systems. In China currently, a very bad situation, heat waves in India. So the point I'm making here is that, first of all, we take a business perspective to this, but I think that anybody who really is an actively conscious and conscientious person in the 21st century has to care and has to see what is their role in fighting climate change, which is the big threat to human civilization in the 21st century. That's why we care, and that's why all our work looks at how can we improve our customer service while at the same time ensuring that we actively deal with this major threat to human civilization. Looking at the next slide, this one provides you an overview of what is it that's going on in Europe, and in the, let's say, in the long term, we're basically looking at similar trends as to what is now happening in Japan. So I think it's very encouraging to see that the Japanese government and also the private sector is stepping up and supporting the long-term decarbonization, and also setting meaningful and relevant interim, let's say, benchmarks. Just last week, the European Commission, which is the executive body of the EU, sent out a big legislative package with a goal of 55% emission reductions over 1990 by 2030. And that's basically to strike the trend towards a net zero by 2050. Now, when this is boiled down to a slide like this, you're like, okay, what is 55? Is it a lot? Is it not a lot? I can tell you from a practical perspective, from the power industry, it is a lot. It is really a lot that needs to happen in a very short time frame. We see this as challenging, but we also see this as an opportunity, and most importantly, as I said, as a necessary thing to do for Europe. So let's have a look at what that means. If we turn to the next slide, what we're trying to do here with a lot of numbers, I concede, is to show you a little bit what does all this mean. Well, first of all, we need to achieve a 40% renewable share in the total economy. That's up from 32, which was a lot already. And in power, because power will gradually increase its share in the overall energy mix, we will need to achieve somewhere around 2/3 of renewable power or renewable sources in the power generation by 2030. Combined then with the other carbon-free sources we have, we would achieve somewhere between 80 and 85% decarbonization of the power sector already in 2030. Moving towards a full decarbonization of the power sector somewhere in the late 30s or beginning of the 40s. We would need to radically improve also energy efficiency. This is also a necessary element in delivering on these targets. Overall, achieving, as I said, those 80 to 85% carbon neutral electricity just 9.5 years by now. So what does that mean in terms of, the changes in the power sector? In Europe, which is in the EU, which is a continent with 450 million people, we will need to deploy 500 gigawatts of renewable capacity in 9.5 years. This is an unprecedented industrial endeavor, and we need urgently to work with governments to get the necessary permits to do this, because the biggest problem now is not industry going against. It's not about the technologies lacking. It's not about the finance lacking. It is about red tape. It is about lengthy permitting procedures, about coordinating with many different authorities, local, regional, statal, and complying with a wealth of different policies, environmental policies. And it's also about private citizens and vested interests working against the deployment of new renewable capacity. So this needs to be fixed very urgently. Otherwise, these targets, this rollout is in immediate risk of delay. Looking towards the end-use sectors, we also need to see significant change. The cars in Europe need to more or less change completely in this time frame as well. By 2035, comparable to the Japanese target, I believe, there will be a zero emissions mandate for new cars. That means you cannot be selling carbon emitting cars by 2035. We have seen policies suggesting 55% emission reductions from cars and 50% emission reductions from vans. What does all that mean? It means that 10 years from now, we will have probably around 50 million electric cars on the roads. 50 million, that's up from 2 today. So this is a very different system in the transport sector we're looking at. It's rich with opportunities for our sector because we will be, at least in part, rolling out the charging infrastructure. We will be serving these cars with electric power, but it is also something that requires some adjustments in the sector. That's very clear. On the building side, we need 35 million buildings to be renewed in this time frame, to be renovated. And we need to install electric heat pumps, and we need to decarbonize the heating systems in other ways. We need to refurbish and insulate the houses better so that the energy consumption in these buildings is lower. So all in all, quite an endeavor, quite a feat we're looking at. In Eurelectric, for the same reason, we call this the electric decade, because this will be a very busy, a very fascinating, a roaring decade, which will gradually switch our societies to a much more electric society. If we take a look at the next slide, I wanted to show you a little bit just how much needs to happen in the longer term. So if we switch towards 2050, our assessment is that to reach net zero or minus 95% emission reductions, we need to see electricity cover 63% of all energy demand in buildings. Today, that share is closer to a third. So we're really looking at a significant ramp up. In transport, we also need to achieve 63% of overall energy demand covered by electricity. Today, that share is less than 1. And in industry, we also need to see a significant ramp up. So the society is going electric, and we support that, and we're ready to serve that. We just need the necessary enabling policies, and we need the bureaucracy to be reduced so that we can act with the necessary speed, because we need speed. Also showing on this slide is that this comes with a number of societal benefits. It comes with jobs, it comes with reductions of energy imports, and it comes with health benefits as a consequence of lower particulate emissions. Moving on to the next slide. I want to try to give you with this slide an overview of what that electric decade means, and first of all, why it's a good idea, and secondly, what are the key elements that need to fall in place for this to happen. Looking at the top of the circular figure on the left-hand side, the reason that electricity is so critical to climate action is that we're looking for system-efficient decarbonization. We need to be energy efficient because we need so many changes in the energy system. Already what we're doing by 2030 requires 500 gigawatts of new capacity. If we want to create hydrogen out of that, we're losing 40% of the energy. So you can see that other avenues will be more energy intensive. There'll be an energy penalty to those. That means also a cost penalty. And that means ultimately a societal penalty. But in order for that massive change in the power sector to happen, we need, first of all, to see modernization of the system. I talked about the change from fossils to renewables. What we also need to see is a strong reinforcement of the infrastructure. 50 million electric cars, 50 million heat pumps by 2030 means that the distribution grids will play a much more central role. So the last mile to the customer, they will be serving different types of loads. They will also be sending electricity back to the grid, lots of the consumers. So we need a system that can handle more complex flows, handle more load. We need to reinforce those systems and optimize them with digital solutions. We also need customer empowerment, because if we can get the 450 million customers or citizens in Europe to do stuff on their own, insulate the houses, choose the heat pump, choose the electric car. Things are going to move much faster. If they don't, if they fight against this, then it's going to be very difficult. And the last thing, of course, the end use sector electrification. We need the uptake of all that new electricity we're producing. Otherwise, there'll be an imbalance between supply and demand. I'll speed up a bit just to get through the slides. So let's move on to the next one. Yeah, so as I showed you, overall, we're looking in the long term at some 60% of the entire total energy demand in society covered by electricity. That also means that we need other stuff to cover the remaining 40. First of all, we need to reduce the overall demand for energy in society. That's efficiency. Secondly, we need to complement the direct electrification with molecules. These molecules, mind you, will mainly be made from electricity. We will produce hydrogen through electrolysis, and from the hydrogen, we will eventually develop different types of products, be it kerosene, be it ammonia, be it methanol, for the long haul transport, which is difficult to decarbonize with direct electrification today. So that's needed as well. And we need, mostly importantly, a system for investment and innovation and a proper regulatory framework to enable all this in such a short time frame. Let's move on to the next slide. The presidency of Eurelectric insists, and we've just had the new presidency team elected, which consists of the president and CEO of EDF, Mr. Jean-Bernard Lévy, of the E.ON CEO and Electrica CEOs, Leo Birnbaum and Corinna Popescu. They've set out 4 priorities, which are, first of all, the European Green Deal is an opportunity for all Europeans, strategically, economically, but also in a more fundamental perspective, in a social perspective. What we're about is creating a low carbon electric lifestyle that is affordable so that people want to go there. We need to rely on the full range of technologies to get there. And we are convinced that a resilient and flexible power system will be at the heart of this. So I think those would be the key messages from me today, and I'm happy to engage and answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank
Thank you very much, Mr. Ruby, for this precious presentation. The power policy from Europe has been well presented, and ambitious vision has been shared with us, and this has been a quite precious opportunity for us. It was inspiring. Let us now have a listen to the presentation from Japan's power sector. Renewable Energy Association for Sustainable Power Supply, or Reasp, chair of the board, Mr. Katsuhito Manabe, is the next presenter. And let me just give you his background. Mr. Manabe, in 1990, graduated from the business administration at Massachusetts State University, and he joined Tokyo branch of Lehman Brothers. And then he went on to Barclays Securities, and he was the top of the financial institution sales, and he was involved in overseas mega solar projects. And in 2012, he established Renewable Japan and assumed the office of managing director. And in 2019, Reasp was initiated, and he became the first chair of the board of this organization. Let me introduce the organization Reasp. Reasp is designed for promoting the deployment of renewable energy and long-term stable power supply. And as I said, it was established in 2019, and power generators and financial institutions and PPS operators and OM operators are the members of this organization, and there are discussions ongoing. More specifically, There were 5 committees with 5 different themes, and there were study meetings and problem-solving discussions are being done, and they come up with the suggestions and policy recommendations so that renewable energy will become the main power supply. So this is the organization to support policies, and this is exactly the theme that we are looking at today. So Mr. Manabe, over to you. Thank you very much for the introduction, very detailed, kind introduction today. And Reasp, as you said, a Renewable Energy Association for Sustainable Power Supply, a very long name. But more recently, we just call ourselves Reasp as an abbreviation of this long name. And as was said in Ms. Takashi's presentation, there are many numbers presented, especially for in accordance with the target of decarbonization, 46% or 50% in 2030. There are numbers for renewable energy that is required, or what would be the goal of the government. We are keenly aware of those numbers as we engage in our activities, but one of the most powerful characteristic of our organization is that we are a group of power generators. What does this mean? If you just sit back and wait, the power supply won't increase. We don't say we are the only one, but we are the group that consists of power generators, and financial institutions are providing funds for 80%. And those are taking the leadership to make policy recommendations, and then we can step forward toward carbon neutral status. So let me just give you the overview of the organization. As Mr. Kahashi has already explained, I'll be very brief on this, but then I would just like to share with you the vision for 2050. In accordance with the government's policy, we would like to come up with our own vision as well. And the numbers for 2030, what would be the background? And as we engage in business or power generation business and develop new power supply resource sources, what other challenges they're facing? I'd like to share those with you. And then renewable energy power source, how we can increase the power source. With some specific numbers, I would like to just share with you. And this is the overview of Reasp. It was established in December 2019, as was said, and then several months afterwards, we were hit by pandemic. So it was difficult to conduct activities, but there are many companies that wish to participate in this organization. There have been very few face-to-face meetings, but there are 78 corporate members, and almost every week we are having several tens of hours of meetings in various committees. So that's our organization. And we would like to increase the renewable energy sources, but the underlying organizations like solar, biomass, or geothermal industry organizations, we are working with those organizations and having discussions on a cross power source basis. And we are making recommendations to various government authorities. And this is the composition. There are 78 corporate members, and most of them are, as I said, power generators. And 1/3 is financial institutions. So power generators and financial institutions constitute about 60 to 70%, 6070. And for all the members, they have the goal of increasing renewable energy. That's a characteristic of our organization. Now, let me just dive into the main business today. As I said, ahead of 2050, we have a vision that has been put together. So based on that, what would be the actions that we have to take by 2030? That's what I'm going to share with you today. First, further to the right, in order to realize carbon neutral status, you have to make the most of renewable energy. Well, the Cabinet Office has come up with this, but we use that as a basic concept. And as we look ahead into 2050, we will come up with the goal to make renewable energy the main power supply. In terms of numbers, we are aiming for 70 to 80% covered by renewable energy. And then what will be the actions that should be taken by 2030? We have come up with those. As I explain later, it will not be that easy. So in terms of solar, 40 yen or 36 yen FIT, but now the 10 yen, starting with 40 yen, but you have to make a viable business with that FIT. So what is most important is how to reduce the cost for renewable energy. So that means how to reduce the burden of taxpayers. And also the grid is important. After you build a power plant, you have to synchronize that into the grid so that power can be purchased. And also you have to live with the communities, and renewable energy source should be stored as well. As Takashi-san said in her presentation, at the top of renewable energy, hydrogen and ammonia representing 1%, but storage, power storage is going to be one of the key points because renewable energies are sometimes called variable energies, but if you can introduce batteries and storage system, then that would change the landscape. Now, at the present, the renewable energy covers or produces 209 billion kilowatt hour at present, and based on our calculation, in 2050, this will be increased to 1 trillion kilowatt hour, meaning 5 times more from renewable energy source. So you have to create that much renewable energy source. Then, what would be the key points in mainstreaming the renewable energy in 2030? At present, renewables is producing 209 billion kilowatt hour in electricity. Then what would be the numbers that we're looking at in 2030? 1.5 times more would be necessary. And this is based on the documents issued on July 13th from the Energy Agency, Resource and Energy Agency. And what would be the point in mainstreaming the renewable energy? Next, please. Earlier, I talked about cost. You need to reduce cost so that business can be more profitable. In FIT, for example, in case of solar power, even if it is 40 yen or 10 yen, for that matter, by reducing cost, you have to keep the same business viability. Otherwise, you cannot procure funds. So on a global basis, if you look at other countries, they are reducing costs to make the businesses viable. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we can do exactly the same in Japan, but we have to get as close as possible to the other countries. And so cost reduction is necessary. By 2025, in case of solar power, 8 yen is the generation cost that we have to aim for. But cost reduction is not enough. It also is applied to photovoltaic or wind power. You need a land site. And so farmlands have to be converted, or farmlands can be converted into photovoltaic sites or solar farm. As was reported in Nikkei the other day, there are land sites that there are no particular landowners, and those land sites can be used for 20 years. That could be a possibility. And also the grid, even if we build power plant as a power generator, you have to have the power purchased by somebody. And so the utilities may be the ones that need to purchase the power through FIT, or the final users could buy the power, but without grid, we will not be able to sell the power. So including the time axis, cost, land sites, and grid, you have to overcome all these issues, including the time frame. Otherwise, you will not be able to increase renewable energy business. Next page. The current status analysis. There could be some harsh comments that I may make. So this is a PV photovoltaic FIT auction status in 2020 as an actual result. 400 megawatts. For example, if you try to be carbon neutral with solar or photovoltaic, if this is the level that we're talking about, you will never be able to do that. So it will be quite challenging for us to achieve that goal only through photovoltaic. So you have to significantly increase the penetration. That's where we are now. So we are talking with the government agency for energy, and also we've have had this discussion with the government advisory committee. But there are 3 points: cost, land, and grid. In order, you have to increase the predictability for the business operator. There is a land site available, and you can reduce the cost, that you can be profitable, and also you can get connected with the grid to sell the power that you generated. So you have to be able to be sure that these will be all overcome. Then you can encourage the operators to develop power source. So in order to do that, the operators have to work with the government to solve these issues. In other words, in order to increase the penetration of renewable energy, you have to create a momentum. And these are the numbers that we're looking at, increasing in terms of increase of renewable energy, or what would be the carbon neutral. But as a business operator, you have to have a specific numbers that will be relevant to that particular business operator. Now, you might think that there's nothing that can be done for the resolution of the issues, but that's not the case. As you see in Nikkei reports, for example, for the farmlands, as you can see from the top chart, the Ministry of Agriculture is looking at dilapidated farmland. There is 192,000 hectares that cannot be regenerated. If you use 1 mega then of solar business per hectare, then 200 giga can be produced from through solar power if you can use this much land site. And if you can also add solar sharing, then you can get closer to the goal. But most of the dilapidated farmland is on the mountainside, so you may not be able to utilize the whole land, but government is making efforts, and this is slowly moving forward toward resolving the issue. And the next problem is a grid. This is about non-firm connection. There's not much capacity available in the grid for the renewable to get connected. That's what is often said. But there are some non-firm connections so that capacity will be made available for renewable energy. Next page, please. This is my last slide. So in this context, what we're doing is that by 2030, well, the momentum is now slowing down, as I said, so you have to step up that momentum. For 1 year, 400 meg for annually should be increased to several gigawatts per year and 1 gigawatts per year for wind power. Then you make another jump, and then there will be a rapid growth after 2030 so that we can achieve the status of carbon neutral 2050. So this is how we would like to proceed with our organization. That's all. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Mr. Manabe. Thank you. So you not just talked about vision, but you also shared with us the current status analysis and what other possible solutions are ongoing. A very comprehensive presentation, which was quite insightful. Thank you. Reasp has financial institutions as members, but in spreading renewable energy, financial industry's role is very important.
And so now we'll move on to a presentation from an expert in the financial industry. And we will be having a presentation from Mr. Seiji Kawazoe, and he is the senior stewardship officer at Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Asset Management. And I apologize for not enunciating properly. Let me introduce his background. In 1987, he joined Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Bank, and he started with securities and exchange sales corporations. And after that, he graduated from the University of London Business School and has served as a foreign equity fund manager, mainly at overseas bases. He was stationed in Europe and was responsible for business planning related to operations in ESG. And after returning to Japan, he was engaged in global engagement activities under the Principles for Responsible Investment to the United Nations. Other than that, he serves as a part-time lecturer at the graduate school at the University of Tokyo and also visiting fellow at the Henry Business School, University of Reading, UK. I apologize for the long introduction here, but let me also introduce briefly his company, Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Asset Management is working on the Climate Action 100 Plus and is a this is a joint engagement initiative by investors actively working on climate change. So the company is working in addressing those climate change issues and is one of the front runners in Japan regarding this. And Mr. Kawazoe is a member of the steering committee and is representing Asian investors. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Mr. Kawazoe to take the floor. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this invitation to participate in the JETI webinar. My name is Kawazoe, and I serve as Senior Stewardship Officer of Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Asset Management. And I'd like to talk about the overview and background of our activities and explain about our position as well as our expectations. So here's my first slide. Regarding climate change, there is movement towards a framework for sustainability. And by having a global framework, it would impact our investments as well. And the ESG approach is something that we are very much placing emphasis on. So next slide, please. So here, this slide shows you our activities for sustainability, especially about materiality for our investments. And when we look at sustainability, we have 12 ESG topics. We have climate change, which is an environmental issue, and this is one of the most important items. And looking at the ESG evaluation, engagement activities, this is our first priority area. Next, this is looking at our assets that we manage. We have not just in Japan, but also overseas global shares. And we have ESG evaluations and engagements that are being conducted on a global, with a global perspective. And I think that's one of the characteristics of our company. And we are invested with the overseas interests as well. And we have these global activities that we are engaged in. Here are some of the initiatives that we're engaged in. For example, the Climate Action 100 Plus, PRI, CDP. We are signatory to these initiatives. And we conduct our engagement activities from these perspectives. So from our asset management activities, we have decided to clarify our position. Just recently, we have decided to join the Net Zero Asset Management Initiative as well. And the basic policy for this is to further enhance the activities for climate change. And by 2050, we'd like to have all our management portfolio to be net zero. The Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative includes 128 asset management organizations, and the total assets under management is $43 trillion. And so there is a significant portion that is going towards this net zero asset management. And we were looking at the portfolio exposure, and for our investments, we will be making sure that we're engaging them to reduce their carbon emissions and to have products that would reduce carbon exposure as well. Next slide, please. This slide is describing a specific activity that we do for engagement. First is this Climate Action 100 Plus. This is something that we've been doing since 2017. This is looking at the GHG emissions and the companies that have a big significant impact. And this is a global activity. For 161 companies, we have a joint engagement. And this is not just power companies, but manufacturing industry and other products. So for high impact companies for GHG emissions is who we engage. In terms of the reaction from the companies, we see that they are starting to take action mid to long term for a low carbon society. And we see that they are showing to start to disclose their policies. And the global companies are gradually moving towards net zero. And we are supporting those movements as well. Next slide, please. In the Asian region, AIGCC, who's the one of the organizers today, actually organizes AUEP, the AIGCC Utilities Engagement Program, and we will be participating in that. So the Climate Action 100 Plus and AUEP is looking at 2050 target for carbon net zero, and that's what's the target. But in Asia, there is many companies engaged in fossil burning thermal power, and we have started activities to engage in those areas. So this would be Japanese power companies, Malaysia, and China companies that we will be focusing on. Next slide, please. So I was just talking about Asia. So let me look at Asia overall and the status of the power companies. So coal-fired thermal and their capacity, and the GHG emissions that's been plotted on these graphs. What's characteristic is that in China, India, there's a different approach that's being taken. So we see that there's a high demand for carbon, and therefore there are many utilities that have high GHG emissions. The AUEP project and CA 100 plus are focusing in on these types of companies as well to encourage GHG reductions, and we'll be clarifying our strategy as well. As we look at these graphs, we look at the Japanese companies overall, we see that it's not too bad, but in Japan, it supports the industry in Japan, and we also have net zero initiatives within Japan. And so we will be further reinforcing engagement activities for domestic companies as well. And in that sense, in terms of the investors' expectations, as I have already mentioned, asset management companies and investors will be more proactive for high impact, high emitters. And we will encourage the 2050 target achievement for low carbon society. Of course, this is not just for the private companies, but also we have expectations in the background for public policy as well. The electric power is a basic infrastructure, and of course, safe and stable as well as affordable is a major expectation, particular with a more implementation of renewables. Carbon pricing and carbon taxes, for example, that could be used as funds that could be then used further. So that type of public policy infrastructure is something that we hope will be put in place as our expectations. That's all for my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Kawazoe.
投資家が業界団体のようにですね、
Investors, similar to industry associations, collaborating and taking initiative is something that perhaps is not well known, especially in Japan. It's not covered very much in the news. And so some of you may not have been aware of this. So thank you very much for that very insightful presentation. And we'd like to move on to the panel discussion now. And I'd like to ask the panelists to turn on their cameras, please.
ルビー様はいらっしゃいます
So
か？
Ruby, are you there? Would you like to turn your camera on?
ちょっとルビー様がいらっしゃるのを待ってみようと思います。
We'd like to wait for Mr. Yes,
はい、皆さん
here he is. Thank you.
では
Everybody is here.
パネルディスカッションということで、
Now I'd like to start the panel discussion.
皆様に共通するテーマ
And there are several themes that are common to all of you.
見解をですね、お伺い
And
して、
we'd like to ask for the insights and perspectives from each one of the panelists. And then we would like to give some time for the audience to ask questions, but that will be the end, toward the end. Now let me take up the first question. What role does Reasp play in ensuring that progressive policies and targets that are set and delivered? What would be the role that power sector should play? So Mr. Manabe just said that you have to have a person or operator that can generate the power. That is the first and foremost. And then you said that you are supporting the policies to encourage that. But especially in terms of policies, what would be the point that you would like to focus on? First of all, 2030 or for the next decade, ahead of 2030, as I said, you have to change the momentum, and that remains unchanged. Going forward, the low FIT, like 10 yen for solar power, or the FIP that will be started from next year, and there is no very little burden on taxpayers' money. Those are going to be started and are being started. And in FIP, if you do the business, what you need to care about is the financial institutions, how you can get the project finance funded by the financial institutions. But it's not just the FIT, the FIP, FIBIT. It's going to be very complicated. I'm not going to go into details, but there are various different counterparties involved. So the things will be more complicated. And you have to have a business and establish a business, including financing. And you have to have a proper discussion at Reasp, and you have to give the feedback to the policies to the government so that you can create a system that will be usable and for everybody. That will be important. And for the new technologies, as Prime Minister Suga advocates, how to increase the offshore wind power. The floated type offshore wind power has not been established as a technology yet. And as an operator, from June or July, there will be a new committee established for offshore wind power, and by having discussions how to develop the technologies and incorporate those technologies will be a key. And this is also going to be a focal government policies. And also another new piece of technology is the storage, the hydrogen and storage battery and ammonia. You have to start using those tools specifically, and these will be part of the themes that you have to look at for the next decade. Thank you. Thank you. It was quite concise and very, very sharp and focused, and it was quite impressive, and I'm quite impressed with your comment. The challenges going forward are clearly shared with us. Thank you. Well, thank you for your compliment. And I'm sure the audience find it quite makes sense. Mr. Ruby, low FIT or FIP, you have to have a system that is easy to use, and offshore wind power and storage technology. Those are the ones that mentioned by Mr. Manabe. But in Europe, Mr. Ruby, there are many things that have to get going. But what would be the most important, most relevant or key that you see, and how Euro Electric would approach those issues? If you can share your perspectives with us, that would be appreciated. Mr. Ruby, please unmute yourself. I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. So I was saying, the situation in Europe is that we really see that the interest from the financial sector is there. So we don't lack the money. There's plenty of money to finance the projects. There is certainly overall a political thrust and a political direction set. There's a strong will and interest from the industry to go there. I think what we really see is that, as I said, we need to remove the red tape, the lengthy bureaucratic permitting procedures, which are significantly holding back the progress. The other thing on the finance side is that investors are always looking for return on their investments, of course. So we need to have quite clear, stable, long-term signals, investment signals, to make sure that the investors also see the business case and that there is a certain visibility on the cash flows. Then I would say that especially that's the case in relation to storage, for instance. The European market is very much one that was designed for short-term dispatch and power plants running on fuel. So it's a marginal pricing system. In order to get big investments in storage going, you need to have more long-term signals for the power sector as well. So these would be two things that I think are really critical to look at. And I think perhaps the last thing that's really overlooked in all this is that we urgently need to reinforce the grids to handle all this. We need to make sure that we have the necessary power grids to integrate all the renewables and to facilitate a more electric society.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ruby, your comment was again quite concise, and I'd like to get back to Mr. Manabe. You said that lengthy process should be removed, and the cash flow visualization and reinforcement of grid, those were mentioned by Mr. Ruby. I think some of them are overlapped with things in Japan, but maybe some others are not. But if you have any concern as the power sector, if you have, for example, questions about how EU is doing and approaching the issues that you have in Japan, if you have any questions to Mr. Ruby. Well, thank you very much. We are a latecomer, especially looking at Europe. What was done in Europe probably will be taken up in Japan. So we'd like to take this opportunity to learn more from Europe. So thank you very much for this question. Especially for photovoltaic, we have finally reached a world where there's no FIT. And for example, power trading or electricity trading, the power generated so far has been sold through FIT so that the business viability will be maintained. But the FIP with cash flow, I think this has been already done in Germany, and you will take the position in the market as a merchant to sell the power. So how to manage the power, in other words, would be the key question that you have to address. So we Japanese business operators would like to learn more about this. So how we should learn this? If there is any advice that Mr. Ruby can give us, that would be appreciated.
まだもしかしたら英訳が続いているかもしれませんが、ルビーさんはいかがでしょうか。
Mr. Ruby, would you like to answer this question?
Well, I think honestly, we're learning too. We are now learning to integrate much higher shares of renewables than we've had in the past. As was mentioned, we are transitioning from a feed-in tariff system today to a feed-in premium system, and we think that can work. The so-called contracts for difference, that is the preferred instrument for offshore, for instance, is working quite well to provide that visibility on cash flows. When it comes to managing the extra amount of electricity, the first things that have been done from the authorities with regard to let's say creating a more agile system, a system that is better at handling variable flows of electricity, have been to amend the market design and create products and a better valuation of flexibility. So that means the ability to provide backup power at short notice. That has been basically coined as separate products in the power market with the latest market reform, and that's helpful to ensure that the system can react fast if there's no variable electricity. The other thing that was done, which I find notable, is that you created the space for an independent demand side response operator. So the idea that apart from just, let's say, taking a supply side perspective on handling the grid, you also look at how can you reduce or adjust the demand side if you have varying, let's say, power output. And currently, the market design was then, a few years ago, the market design was then adjusted to make sure that those independent demand side response operators could aggregate power, aggregate demand, and then basically feed it into the market as a product as such. So I think these are some of the tweaks that have been made, but it's also very clear that the more fundamental, let's say, power market design needs to be revisited as we move into an era of clear, let's say, dominance of renewable energy, because renewable energy is a bit of a different, let's say, system, and the role of marginal pricing will be much smaller in the future. In the future, it'll be about financing the big upfront capital investments.
Thank you very much. And I think if I continue to ask my questions, we'll run out of time. So I will no longer ask any more questions, but I hope to continue this relationship into the future. And I believe that if you were to have a one-on-one conversation, it would be conducive to push forward your policies mutually. So what I'd like to ask you both is about, Mr. Ruby talked about changing market design, the necessity of changing policy. But as industry organizations, how would you contribute to that or achieve that? I'd like to delve into that a little bit more, especially in Europe. I think, Mr. Ruby, you talked about having different levels. You have the government level, you have the regional EU level, and then you have your local municipality levels. So as an industry organization, how do you actually make sure you're effective in engaging those different parties? I would be interested to understand that as as far as time allows, or you are able to tell us. I should ask Mr. Ruby, please go first, Mr. Ruby.
Sure. What my organization does is basically to advise policymakers at the highest level, at the highest EU level. Our members are the national associations. They engage with the national governments, and then the companies basically and the national associations also talk to the municipal level, the regional level. But in essence, everything needs to flow from overarching policies, and there needs to be a fundamental alignment with the between the carbon emission reduction targets and the enabling policies that need to drive this. I think one of the apart from making recommendations, advising, developing studies and scientific foundations for these discussions, what we've done is basically to team up with other industries. We've changed our outlook a lot in the last few years. If you look back 10 years, this industry would be much about security of supply, making sure that electricity was a stable, sound product. What we're now doing is to team up with other industries, with the transport industry, with the heavy industries, and also with building owners and people in that space, to see how we can, what is really needed to make all this happen at the same time. The good example is transport. As I explained, we have around 2 million electric cars in Europe today, so battery, electric, and hybrid. We need to go to 30, 40, 50 million by 2030. This is an exponential increase that has rarely been seen before, such a massive shift. It's very clear that the car manufacturers, they need also to be reassured that customers will buy these and that there is a charging infrastructure to rely on. So we have been working closely with other industries to say what is needed from policymakers, not from one industry perspective, but from a dual industry perspective. And we've tried to also integrate the NGOs in this discussion. So for instance, in 2019, we teamed up with the biggest car manufacturing association and the most important civil society organization in the transport space. And we said, in order for the electrification of transport to be successful, we need to institute a right for the consumer to plug. And we need governments to roll out that infrastructure and provide signals for that infrastructure to roll out, so that we don't have a situation where the cars is waiting for the charging and the charging is waiting for the cars and we don't get anywhere. So that's a key element that I think is important. And we need to replicate this also in an international context. Look at shipping, where we need to create a global supply for ammonia for long-haul shipping, for instance. This needs to be globally coordinated between Japan, China, Europe, and the US, Australia, in order to work. And so we need to work together in new ways to make all this happen in this short time frame.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to ask Mr. Manabe to give his response and then go back to Mr. Ruby and then to Mr. Kawazoe. So Mr. Manabe, what would be your position? Well, in Europe, Mr. Ruby, in Japan, compared to that, we've only been in place for a short time. And so in terms of the government and the ministries, we're working with METI, the Economy, Trade and Industry Ministry, as well as the Agency of Natural Resource and Energy. That's our main place, but we also work with the Ministry of Environment and also the Finance Agency as well. And also for the farmland issue, we work with the Ministry of our agriculture and forestries as well. So other than that, we also have the LDP, the majority parties, climate coalition, and also we have provided some comments to the government task force as well. So we also provide a position paper as the industry, and we provide our thoughts as well. And we also have discussions about vision for 2050. But as we have discussions with the various ministries, it's what they say is that it's fine for you to develop your position papers and provide them to us, but they want us to work together. And actually, in that sense, they are very cooperative, and they're looking for real practical on the field problem solving. Of course, different ministries have their different colors, so to speak, but it seems that it might be even completely different organizations. But what's common is that everybody wants to push forward renewables. And so my impression is that they really want to work together to try to solve the issues. And also in looking at the local governments, the municipalities, well, the government actually provides, the central government provides subsidies. For example, solar, by 2030, the numbers are changing, but they're looking for 88 gigawatts, but they're looking for 30 gigawatts. And these types of numbers are coming out. And for the public spaces is mainly the solar panel in order to bump it up 20 gigawatts. So that's something that the central government is doing. But we want to have more of these projects, and that's really the main message that's coming out of the central governments. And we are an organization of generators, and so these members are looking at the local demand, and I think we need to work together to try to build that demand even further. And so again, with the ministries, government, and then working with the local entities as well. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you very much. As I listened to the two gentlemen's comments, I wanted to ask this question. Well, in order to change policies, of course, I have opportunities to talk to the government agencies, but you have to convince the public, members of the public. Otherwise, those will not be funded, and bureaucrats as well as business operators are having difficulty. So as Mr. Manabe said, the business operators and government officials are working together and they try to move forward, but it's sometimes difficult to get the consensus from the general public. And so that may be an issue. In the example of Japan, as Mr. Ruby referred to, as a background information, I just would like to talk about the situation in Japan. There are very few flatlands in Japan. So where are you going to install solar panels? That is tends to attract attention. Are you going to install the panels in the mountains? That would undermine the landscape, and also it could undermine safety. So those are the views that are salient from the general public, and the government is concerned about these comments, and how to get the general public on board is a question, and that will be very important for the relationship or collaboration between the operators and the government. And Mr. Ruby, when you introduce heat pumps, and then if the general public says no, then you can't do that. That's what you said. So how are you going to address these issues? If there are any resolutions, I would like to hear them. And also Mr. Kawazoe, as financial institution, if there are any undertaking that you're doing, if you can share that with us, that would be also appreciated. So I have to call Mr. Ruby and Mr. Manabe and Mr. Kawazoe, in that order, please make comments.
Thank you. I think what you're referring to here is one of the biggest challenges that we will be facing in the coming years. And I think we need to think very deeply about this, and we need to come to a completely different approach than we've had before. It is in Europe very clear that the vast majority of population is very committed and caring about the overall green transition. It's also very clear that they don't really want to have the necessary machinery in their backyard. They don't like to look at wind turbines. They don't like the solar panels too much, and they don't like the grids. Now, we need to transcend this contradiction. And I think there are a few things we need to do. First of all, we need to build all the capacity we can far from people. So that means offshore wind is a very good idea. Secondly, we need to work in a different way than we have before when it comes to deploying onshore renewable power. There has been a tendency to think of utilities as companies that operate within, a very controlled space that is barred from the public, because the power plants, the conventional power plants are quite dangerous machines. You don't want to come too close to them for different reasons, and you don't want the public to be all over it. Now, if you look at a big solar park, for instance, there's not that much of an immediate risk of being close to a solar plant. And we need to transcend the idea that a solar plant is ugly, for instance. So we need to create a new type of installation which allows for people to interact with the power systems, to be amongst power systems. We need for a new type of power plant that is environmentally friendly and can be a hotspot or a hub for biodiversity, so that taking space for power plants does not mean that you are losing out on biodiversity. So we need to think in an integral manner about aesthetics, about power supply, about interaction with people surrounding nature, and we need to find win-win solutions here. Now, one thing that is critical in this is, again, in the past, the business models of utilities would be separate from people. You would not want too much involvement of private citizens in that. That was sort of more controlled. What we found out in my country, Denmark, which has built wind turbines since the 70s, was that if the neighbor owns part of the wind turbine, for some reason, he really likes it. If he does not own it, he hates it and he doesn't want to see it, and he will be fighting against it. If he owns a small part of it, and that small part sends money to his pension scheme, then all of a sudden the acceptance is much higher. So shared ownership, integral solutions that take into account climate resilience, culture, aesthetics, and biodiversity in the planning, so that you get beautiful power plants that allow for human interaction and can help screen and guard society against the most adverse impacts of climate change. I think these are critical thoughts that we need to integrate when we build the power system of the future.
Thank you very much. Well, partial ownership is probably related to local production, local consumption being important in Japan, because you can benefit the local community through the power system. Mr. Manabe, well, power generators and the general public, it might be difficult to interact with the people, I would assume. Yes, you have to work with the community, and that is necessary. But in order to get understanding from the public, you have to reduce the burden on the part of the general public. There is a surcharge for the renewable energy, and there will be some remaining FIT that will be increased. So your power charges, monthly bills will be increased. So in order to make it more affordable, you have to make sure that there is no burden on the part of the general public, and you have to increase that type of renewable energy. That is the assumption prerequisite. And what else is necessary? There are two, symbiosis with the community, and also you have to work with the community to produce something. What is characteristic about Japan is that, as Mr. Ruby said, the low voltage or less than 50 kilo power generation represents about 40% of the industry power generation. 40, the mini solar, as we call it. That is sometimes purchased for tax saving, but power generators are not that aware of that. But actually, this represents 40% of the industry power consumption. And the power plants without fence may be owned by somebody, or even if there are weeds, you don't cut the weeds, and you don't mind having some disputes with the neighbors. So the cause for the disputes with the neighbors, the government officials believe that it is solar power. Because of the solar power, there's disputes. But in 20 years, maybe the cheaper power generation system may be lower quality, and they may not be removed, and they will be just left unattended. That is the concern that the general public has. So you have to build high quality power plants, and you have to make sure that this will be maintained for 30, 40 years. And you have to have a operator that will be responsible for that long-term business. So there are many issues that you have to address as you explore new power sources, as well as continue with the existing power sources. You have to have the coexistence with the community, and the power system or power plants have to be built properly that will last long. And that is very important. Thank you very much. So you have to take advantage of the strengths of the power generator to encourage understanding from the local community. Mr. Kawazoe, thank you very much for waiting. Your turn.
So, as we're an asset management company, I'd like to talk about that perspective. We have to make sure that we do our part in making things are smooth, and make sure that things are stable. Investors are not really interested. We like to avoid things that are unstable. So I think that we need to make sure that the visibility is in place, and we need to have the policies that ensure that. That's something that we'd like to see. Also, another point is that when we look at the private sector, the customer has to have solutions in place, and there has to be a solution provider type of role, and that could be done from industry organizations, and perhaps not just utility companies. Maybe that could be financial institutions, or maybe it could be some government organizations, but having that solution, having that as a service is something that we would look for as well. It would be a multiplier. It's not just, going to be times one. It would be times two, times three, times four. It's having that kind of value generated and actually attracting more. And so I hope that that could possibly lead to something that positive. And when we say 5G for telecommunications, people really are receptive to it. And I think that renewables is something that could be also, something that's well received. People are positive about in a similar way. So thank you very much. And that was a opinion from the finance industry. So Manabe-san, maybe that could be useful for you. Thank you very much. And we only have 3 more minutes from the Secretariat. I think that one of the major topics was about policy engagement and lobbying and the transparency about those activities. So perhaps I can ask each of you to give a comment for that. And then after that, we can move on to questions from the audience. So Mr. Kawazoe, for the companies, for good policies to be put in place in the companies, good engagement. I think that you are in a position of interacting with companies in order to kind of push that or encourage that. What do you need to know? What is the disclosure that you need regarding corporations and their lobbying activities? And then for Mr. Manabe, Mr. Ruby, I'd like to ask what there are information that investors and the people want. How do you ensure transparency in providing that information? So first, I'd like to ask Mr. Kawazoe to respond. Well, from my perspective, as we look at the energy transition by 2050, we can first look at 2030 and looking at the mid to long term business strategy. What is the capital allocation? What's the strategy? And what kind of technological milestones are defined? What kind of deregulation is required? So that type of pathway should be clarified. And that's something that we have asked to be done. And through that, I think that will allow various issues or challenges to surface. And that would allow a faster response. And that's not something within Japan, but I think that globally, this type of common awareness is beginning to evolve. And I think that that's something that would take place as well. So, Mr. Ruby, there are various organizations and government agencies that you are working with, but how do you ensure transparency? Could you speak a little bit about that?
Sorry. Yeah, there's a lot of efforts going into making sure that we're very transparent. In Europe, there's a whole set of transparency rules where we register all high-level meetings that we go to, and so that everybody can know where we've been, who we've talked to, and what our messages are. But I think that accountability and clarity in the messaging is key to be successful. And I think you can also see that the strategies that the strategies that you should not be pursuing, such as astroturfs and setting up fake organizations and the like, that is proving to be you tend to get punished. We've seen some pretty bad examples of that in the US, for instance, where companies are creating fake organizations to dissociate themselves from the message they actually want to send.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ruby, I think you were a bit frozen on your end, but I think you're now back online. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your comment. And Mr. Manabe, please then. So when we talk about transparency, Mr. Kawazoe, in your perspective, it's not just industry organization, but financial organizations. And for us, we're mainly made up of power generators. Those are our core members. So this might be my personal opinion, but when we look at the international net zero climate change issues, financial organizations have kind of taken a central role, and it's the wave has reached Japan, and so I wonder how high the awareness is. For example, in Japan, compared to other countries, how high is that awareness in Japan? And I apologize that I'm answering a question with a question to Kawazoe-san, but I would very much be interested in your opinion. Well, if we look at the global engagement activities, especially with Europe, they are relatively very much open to those interactions and provide disclosure. But I think in Japan overall, it's not at that level yet. So there's a difference in terms of the level of disclosure, I believe. So I think that Mr. Ruby mentioned that the majority of people are committed to, climate change issues or, the environment. And I was very much envious of that because in Japan, I said that, well, I wish that I could say that the Japanese people are committed to renewables. And I wondered, would I be able to say that? No, maybe the term literacy isn't the most appropriate term to use, but looking at the climate change issues, I hope that including mass media and the people would be more focused and pay more attention to these issues.
はい。ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. I will make sure to inform my organization's communication team. It's about raising awareness and public opinion. And this is about the sense of urgency or crisis about climate change. And that's a bit weak in Japan, so we will do our part for that. We actually have received some questions from the audience, and I'd like to move on to those questions. I will read out the question, but this actually might have already been resolved through our discussion. So what is the general view on community-based renewable energy in Japan in terms of its role in Japan's low carbon transition? Will it be one of the priority actions? And how is the government pushing the community renewable energy in terms of policies and incentives?
So it was said that local production and local consumption is being promoted by the government. But Mr. Manabe? Yes, I agree. How do you define community-based renewables is a key, but local production, local consumption, or local governments are the key players. But what has become problem is that if you talk about local production, local consumption, regional power generators are actually having a problem in continuing with the business. So, but local production, local consumption, and community or microgrids, including the subsidies from the government, will probably continue to spread. That's my view. Thank you. Another question on Japan. So, Mr. Manabe, once again, if we can answer this question. The solar installed capacity in Japan is the third largest in the world behind Germany, but its generation by solar in Japan is lower. Is there any restriction? Very specific question. Well, can you repeat the question? The capacity, in terms of capacity, Japan is the third largest, but the generation, actual power generated is the lower. Why is that? I don't know the numbers behind this question, but first of all, energy demand or the solar radiation in Japan may be an issue. If you look at the average, well, if you look at the Italy and Spain, the generation power generated is very low in Japan. Maybe it's not the case with the UK. If that is the question, then that's one of the answers that I can give. Thank you. Another question is about energy mix. It was in English. Is there any breakdown for the energy mix by power source? Yes, I will send that to JTIF Secretariat, because this is the information that is posted to the Agency for Resources and Energy. So you can take a look at that. And then there's another question. I think this is something that we would like to see from Europe as well. I think the population wants the increase in expansion of renewable energy, but who is going to pay for? You have to have consensus, because that consensus is vague, and the FIT surcharge is increasing, and the taxpayers is paying for this without knowing it. Should it be just left unattended? Well, but there is a change, and there's business operator that is going to change, or to change that, yes. Well, you have to pay for that if you use that. For example, you can take advantage of technology or innovation, and you have to also allocate the money for technology or innovation. So this is a mechanism, part of the mechanism. And if this becomes some kind of penalty, then that shouldn't be good. So you have to make sure that that won't be the case. You have to have a levelization of the burden. Mr. Ruby, can you tell us how the situation is in Europe? There is a very deep issue about taxpayers' burden, and Europeans are quite aware of the climate change, but they don't like the power bills to increase. So how do you address this? Of course, the answer may be just to reduce the cost, but for the time being, FIT and FIP, as long as they continue, then you have to have the general public pay for that partially at least. So how are you going to address that?
Yeah, I think first of all, we need to distinguish between a cost and an investment. You know, cost is something you pay when you go and buy your cornflakes or your soap. An investment is something where you put your savings and then you get money back. As a society, we're making a giant investment in a climate-friendly, climate-resilient society. If we don't make that investment, then we're going to have many costs. Then we need to pay for our car every time it sails away with a new flooding. We need to pay for our house every time it burns off with a heat wave. So this is a necessary investment we're making. So now, what about the costs for the FIT, for instance? Now, first of all, we have abolished FITs in Europe because they're not helpful for the market design. We have moved to other types of investment stability mechanisms. So one of the things you can do is essentially to create a neutral instrument which provides visibility on the cash upfront, but actually ensures the payback over time. So it's just a matter of when that money is given. Eventually, it can be given back to the customers. Now, the third point I want to make here is we have to be honest about the fact that we have some investments, and investments require money. Now, could there be someone who gets caught up in this? Yes, the poor people. So what do we do with the poor people? Let's have a very, very careful look at how we ensure that we don't create energy poverty while we create this transition. And there are many ways of doing this. Your Electric has developed individual studies on this, and there are many, many good tricks to pull. First of all, why not make a government initiative to insulate the houses of poor people? That way you reduce their energy bill, you give them some value, and you don't have that problem. So you actually help the societal equity and the societal justice. Another thing you can do is to basically create a fund with which you finance, let's say, the FIP or whatever instrument you're using, so that this is not just added and slapped on top of the bill. And a third thing you can do is, for instance, if you do carbon pricing, so you tax the carbon, but you take that money and you reallocate it to people. So there are many instruments you can use to ensure that this happens in a just way. You have to also carefully design the incentives, for instance, for electric cars, so that it's not only the rich people who get the electric cars, but that there's also an offer for the poorer people. And in that way, you can create a societally fair transition. And I think that's also important for the buy-in and the support overall from citizens.
Thank you, Mr. Manabe. I definitely would like you to make comments, but the Secretariat is telling me that we have to wrap up. So please make sure that you be concise, as you are very good at being concise. Let me just give you numbers. For renewable energy surcharge, that will be increased probably, because the solar power that is operating is 60 gig. 40 yen or 36 yen FIT are the vast majority. And in addition to that, there will be more to come. So the numbers would increase automatically. However, in 36% or 38% for 2030, or in 2050, we have to be carbon neutral, or 60 to 70% for renewable energy, then what sort of power sources will be necessary? Those with lower FIT, like 10 yen or 8 yen, or FIP, or FIT with very little public burden. So basically, with very little public burden, like 36% or 38% for renewable energy. I don't know about solar business. It's now 60 gig, but it should be increased to 250 gig. So you need another 220 gig. And then the taxpayers' money would be very little to be used. So for the moment, you would increase the number, but for over time, it will be decreased. With the current system, you have no choice but to see the increase for the moment, but going forward in the future, you have to create or develop the power source that will be cheaper. Thank you very much. Well, I have jumped one topic to another, but you are all specialists, and I'm very impressed that you have given us quite insightful comments as answer. So I would like to now conclude this webinar of the policy innovation in the power sector towards net zero emissions. Thank you very much for very insightful comments. I'd like to turn the microphone over to Secretariat.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your participation despite your busy schedules. And I'd like to thank all of the presenters for this webinar as well. For the audience members, we'd like to ask you to complete the feedback sheet. Please access it with the link in the chat. And once we receive consent from the presenters, we would like to provide the presentation materials to the email address that you have registered with us. And we'd like to continue to provide these webinars regarding climate change and energy. So we hope to see you again. With that, I'd like to conclude today's webinar. Thank you very much for all of the participants, including all of the presenters. Thank you very much once again. And this will be the end of the session. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。